Um, Perhaps one, and this is one we hear about a lot, is compulsion of some kind. Although there is no mandatory education law, federally speaking, for Indians until the 1890s, there were in fact a lot of methods used to compel Indian children to go to school or compel their parents to send them there. And I would say, although there are stories of kidnappings and actually grabbing children up, I would say that is not the most common method by which they got there. Instead, coercion was often used, and that may have come in the form of agents who perhaps weren't very ethical, I guess we could say, withholding things like rations or access to goods, annuities that were promised as part of treaties, withholding those things from Indian families until they agreed to submit and send their children. For others, there may have been a sense of adventure in this, and they may have actually asked to go and been given permission. That is the case with some of Pratt's earliest students. Now, they didn't know what they were in for, and many of them bucked at the system once they got there. But it represented for them something beyond the reservation for those young children. For their parents, the schools also represented something beyond the reservation, and again, there may be a myriad of responses to that. Reservations in this period, particularly, and could be said the same of some of them today, are pretty desperate places. In this time, we're talking about Indians as wards, so they can't really leave. They're not allowed to travel freely. So coming to school would be one way to get around that and to have a different experience, and to know that your children would be at least fed and clothed in a better manner than perhaps what existed there. And further than that, that there may be some opportunity that lies out there once an education has been given or instilled. So all of those reasons and more, I think, speak to why tribes migrated. And I think by 1900, there would be about 50 or 60 tribes represented today, or represented at the school, which is pretty impressive considering today we have about twice that number. So if by 115 years ago there are half that number of tribes being represented, something is bringing them there. And it's not just them being forced to go, although the field of choices may be somewhat limiting. There may also, as I made reference to, be advantages to this re-education, as I like to call it, because if we just call it education, it glosses over the fact that there are traditional modes of education. In the very earliest years, particularly in the first year, some parents came along with their children. They wanted to be assured, like Red Wolf, and the quote that I used at the beginning, that what was going on here was on the up and up. I think we can extend this to other cultures, certainly, but particularly a lot of literature exists that shows that Indian parents prized their children above anything else. And to let them go would be the hardest decision that they could possibly make. And again, I think that's applicable to other cultures. I use this expression, trust issues, because it's kind of a pun. Obviously, the parents wanted to be able to trust their children into the hands of this environment, but the word trust in Indian country means something else too. When we talk about the relationship between tribes and the federal government, the trust responsibility that the federal government has to uphold its end of treaties. And in many cases, that would include education. Education was something that was promised as part of treaties for the relinquishment of land claims. Now, Pratt and the superintendents at Haskell and the other schools had in their minds that when Indian children finished their course of study, which might be anywhere from 5 to 7 or 8 years, during which time they might get to go home in the summers, or they might not, that they would be so immersed in the dominant culture's ways of doing things and the ways of thinking that they wouldn't want to go back home. But an unintended consequence, a contradiction, if you will, of this education or re-education is that the vast majority of them did return home. And I asked the question why. I showed a film in class yesterday in which a former boarding school student talked about how horrifying it was for him to return back home, this place that he had been so homesick for and wanted to return to the whole time he was away at school, and realize that he could no longer communicate with his grandparents in his native tongue because it had been lost in the time that he was away from school. So to answer the question why, well, you might want to return to what's familiar, but beyond that, I think this speaks to something that's a really genuine Native American trait of adaptation, that children were, from the beginning and increasingly as time went on, adapting to what they could get out of the education to their own needs, and particularly what would service their tribes. So they were speaking to a very old trait of putting the group before the individual, which is precisely the opposite of what the schools were trying to train them to do. They were returning home so that they could help their parents, so that they could help their elders, so that they could help their tribe. Some children, of course, never left. And if you're familiar with the Haskell campus at all, I see it every day when I go to my office. There's a small cemetery in the corner of the campus, and this represents some of the level of sacrifice that those early students in particular made. Most of these stones represent children, some very young, from the earliest period, from the first decade especially, certainly the first 25 years, although there are a handful from the 20th century. I think the latest one is about 1940. Language is another aspect of this conference, and I wanted to speak to it because the schools were set up to strip away identity, kill the Indian and save the man, right? Save the person, but take away everything that made this person indigenous, that connected them to their culture. So it's an assault on cultures, it's an assault on identity, and language, of course, is fundamental to identity. Students' appearance and outlook would be changed. Pratt was very, very fond of these before and after kind of pictures. This is a young man, Navajo, Tom Tarlino, and it shows him when he entered Carlisle, and then again just a few months later. Pratt really liked the idea of these contrasts. And again, the Carlisle students, Apaches, none of whom I would say look very too happy to be there. And then the same students again a few months later. This is a picture from Haskell. It's the music room and the conservatory, if you will, which is again a very Western kind of appearance in and of itself. And the women here, I don't think at first glance you'd ever peg as being Native people, at least not even in our conception of what they would look like in the 19th century. This is a student at Haskell in 1884, Nellie Keokuk. She obviously has some Native features, but the dress, the appearance, the style of the photo, etc., all very much in keeping with Western appearance, Western ways of thinking, of conceiving. The schoolroom at Haskell, and you can see there are some pretty young kids there. Again, appearance has been changed. Hair has been cut. They are usually given a new name, a new, more acceptable, if you will, Western name. I was telling my students the other day, because one of them asked about this, names might be, if your father's name was something that we might consider more traditional, Running Elk or something like that, then you might adopt a Western first name and keep that Running Elk as your surname. So Nathan Running Elk or something like that. Having looked at the student records for the early period, I've also seen some pretty odd names, I think, like Napoleon Bonaparte, Abraham Lincoln, names like that, where it was probably the work of some administrator who simply assigned a name based on a personal hero, or thinking that that was a strong name, or something like that, again, through a Western lens. The focus here was on English first, Christianity, strangely enough, even though this is a federal institution. It had its own chapel. The students, one of the few opportunities they were allowed to leave campus on Sundays was to come to the town, to the denominational Christian church of their choice. And along with Christianity, presumably, comes that Protestant work ethic, because I think certainly in 19th century America, Catholics weren't considered to be mainstream Christian, although there are some Catholic students, certainly. So I focused here on the hard work, and this is the blacksmithing shop. Students would have gone to school for half a day, a very remedial kind of education, what they used to call the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic. And then the other half of the day, they put in service into some kind of trade skill, ostensibly. So that you saw the blacksmith shop, this is the paint shop, and the biggest labor pool at the school went to the school's farm, where they produced thousands and thousands of pounds of vegetables. They raised dairy cows, etc. I don't have any pictures, good pictures of the farm. I couldn't get them to come out. The printing office. So they're teaching some trades, again, according to Western modes of thinking. This is the Sloyd shop. I don't know if anybody's familiar with what Sloyd means. It was a very popular Scandinavian holistic educational curriculum in the 19th century. And it addressed both mental and physical modes of work. And so that was part of the Haskell program. The wheelwright's apprentice, making wheels, sewing room. And this one is particularly stark, gives you a nice flavor of that cold institutional place. Students working in the laundry. And again, I don't have enough time to talk about this, but if you think about it, students are actually doing a lot of the work of the school. This is a model of self-sufficiency too, and it's saving taxpayers, many of whom still have that old the only good Indian is a dead Indian, or nits make lice mentality. This is the answer to those complaints about why are we funding this. Hard work and discipline, also Western concepts of labor. So the farm, for instance, all boys. And for tribes like the Pawnees or the Iroquois, the 5 nations, 6 nations at that time, I guess, where women were farmers, and that was tied to their concept of the world that women give birth, and therefore should also be the nurturers of the fruit of the land. This would have been a real affront. I don't think that's something that Haskell administrators or reformers ever took into account, because they didn't ever see the need to look into what Indian cultures were all about. This is an unintended consequence, but it would have very much been another additional slap in the face to ideas about identity. So the tailor shop here, all boys, because in Western society, tailors would be men. The sewing room, all women, as women would, generally speaking, be homemakers. I did find a few pictures where you have a mixture of both men and women, and that I thought was somewhat forward-thinking. So again, something of a contradiction to what we might think when we make the step from the outside of thinking, perhaps, oh, what have we done in terms of assaulting this identity, but then we actually look at the program that's being put forward here. In some ways, it is rather progressive. Shorthand class, again, a mixture of both men and women. Surprising, Haskell in the 1890s, just after the period that I'm really focusing on here today, but I wanted to include it, also had some other more advanced areas of study. So a normal department, which is another one of those words we don't use very much anymore, but the Kansas State Teachers College, now Emporia State University, used to be called a normal school. Normal was the course of study for educators, for teachers. And again, there's the normal kindergarten. So you have the older students who are going through this course of study actually teaching some of the